Welcome back, Gay Pushers, and today's lesson is going to be on the progressive era. So let's get to it and figure out what happens in the progressive era that led to social changes in the United States. So the progressive era is going to start at the beginning of the 1900s, and from around 1900 to around 1920 is really going to be the era of the progressive movement. What the progressive movement is the question that I'm going to have for you is evaluate the effectiveness of the reformers and the federal government to bring about reform at the national level. So did the federal government do enough? Did the reformers do enough to cause enough change to happen in the progressive era? The progressive era had a lot of issues that were faced by the end of the 19th century. This is coming out of the Gilded Age. So if you're contextualizing this, you should be talking about the Gilded Age and how the Gilded Age had a lot of problems. Big business was unchecked. Monopolies and trusts were running wild. Working conditions were absolutely horrible. Food conditions were even terrible as well too. If you ever get the chance, check out the documentary The Food That Built America." It's absolutely disgusting, the food that people ate at this time. And so there's a lot of social issues that are going on. You have a rise of big cities. Overnight, cities boom. Immigration is coming to the United States in massive ways. And so there is need for reforms in the early 20th century. So what is the progressive era? And I think what ultimately sums up the progressive era is this quote: "The heart of the movement is to use government as an agency of human welfare." The government was meant to fix the social problems. People were looking for the government to make laws on the environment, make laws on working conditions, make laws on labor unions, make laws on suffrage for women. So ultimately, this progressive movement was meant to look at the government fixing the problems of it. And we look at the umbrella of the progressive movement. There's a number of different things that happens. It's going to start with the muckrakers, which I'll get to in a little bit. It's going to be the people that write these exaggerating stories like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, or even Ida Tarbell's Standard Oil Trust. It's the writers that are going to start exposing the ideas. But there's a lot of things that happen in here. It's usually going to be your middle-class women, your Karens, that are going to start having this progressive era. They're going to have a little more time on their hands. They're going to fight for social issues. Labor unions are going to fight for social issues. They're going to fight for working conditions. They're going to fight for hours, overtime pay, health care, benefits, stuff like that. Ultimately, civil rights is also grouped into this too, because the NAACP is founded in this time period, but it takes a back burner to every other issue. We're going to find the civil rights movement and anti-lynching laws not get passed during this progressive era. Civil rights really takes a hurt, even though Du Bois and Washington were pushing at this time. So a progressive was somebody that wanted new social reforms and wanted new ideas in the country. Progressives were usually inspired by muckrakers. They were usually white middle-class people, and what happens is they have a little more time on their hands because they're taking white-collar jobs. They're not working not working 9 to 9, 12 days, 7 days a week. They actually got a little bit of time to do some work. Progressives are not the business class and the upper class either. And so what we're going to see is there is a lot of social changes that are going to happen. One book that comes out about the food is Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. What ended up happening was a lot of people were getting sick. A lot of people were getting stomach cancer in the early 1900s. In your food in the early 1900s, to preserve food for milk, they were putting bleach in milk to make it stay white. They were putting formaldehyde into some of your food just to keep the color in the right way. Cocaine was used in Coca-Cola. Your food was not good at all. And so in the early 20th century, you're going to start to see a change in food. And so one book that really set the tone was Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. There was times that people would get meat that was so rancid, but meat was expensive, so they ate meat that wasn't cooked, that had worms in it. What they found is in Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, in the meat packing factories in Chicago, there was pieces of chicken, there's pieces of ham, pig, rats, rope, sawdust, and then they called it chicken. And so the book exposed the awfulness of the meatpacking industry. It absolutely disgusted President Roosevelt at the time, and so he passes what's called the Pure Food and Drug Act and also the Meat Inspection Act, which better supplies your food. The term muckraker comes from Teddy Roosevelt, where it's somebody that takes up the filth of the dirt. And so here you see, of course, investigation in the meat scandal. We're going to see that this is just an ever-growing part of the pendulum swing, where we go from very conservative to very liberal, very conservative, very liberal. And the progressive movement would be very, very liberal at this time, much like the antebellum reforms, much like the Populist Party and the New Deal. They all have similarities in them. So if you can find those similarities between them, you'll do really well in your essay. What ends up happening is the growth of cities causes this, and there's political, social, and economic times too. There are three presidents. It's going to really start with Teddy Roosevelt. He's going to be the Republican president. He's going to give him his reign to Taft and then Wilson as well too. These three presidents are going to dominate during the early 1900s, and they are going to be the progressive issues here at home. At the exact same time, we're also talking about being imperialistic, where we're going overseas. That has nothing to do with what the progressive era is. This is more just social issues here at home. There are books there was tons of books like Ida Tarbell's Upton Sinclair's Jungle, Jacob Riss, How the Other Half Lives, Lincoln Steffens, Shame of Cities. He wrote a number of stories. It's not necessarily one book, but he wrote stories for a bunch of newspapers at the time, talking about the corruption in big government. Really, the big thing that comes to your mind in the corruption is Boss Tweed. Now, that's past, but it was going on everywhere, and there's still corruption going on today. There's other books like, Dresser's Financial and Titan and The Treason in the Senate. So many different books that are out there. If you know a few of them to add to your outside knowledge, you would be doing really, really well. One of the things that we're going to look at is that last year's exam was this question, and so evaluate the extent to which the progressive movement fostered change. I don't think you're going to have this as your test question, but it is a good idea to go over it because you may be able to link this in other ways in your contextualization, or you may be able to link this together in your analysis point. What Roosevelt's going to pass is what's called the square deal. In the square deal, he's going to say there's good trust and bad trust. Good trust need to be preserved, but bad trust need to be taken out, back, and shot. And so here you see there. He was also, part of his square deal was stopping railroads from giving rebates to customers. So big businesses were getting rebates and getting cheaper products to ship, getting cheaper rates to ship their products than maybe an individual farmer. So that had to stop because the farmer, to make up for those rebates, the farmer got charged more money. So here's John D. Rockefeller with his oil company. He may be charged 50% less because he's a big business owner and he ships a lot, but that 50% still needs to be made up. So what happens is they add it to the individual farmer, and the farmer just gets murdered in the rates. So he really regulates a lot of the railroads, and he supports the railroads, and he supports individual people. And that's why Teddy Roosevelt really is a great president. He's also going to form the National Park System. He is a huge conservativist. He's going to conserve land, forest, trees, you name it, in this way. A couple other things later on. Teddy Roosevelt is going to go till 1908, and in 1908 he's going to pass his baton off to Taft. Taft is going to become president. He's going to go against William Jennings Bryan for the last time. William Jennings Bryan, again, third candidate for president. He did run as a populist candidate in 1896, so he has a lot of the social issues that you're going to talk about in a few, but it doesn't go. Child labor was huge at this time as well too. You see an image like this, and it breaks your heart to see children with short lifespans. They're going to lose a lot toes and fingers in these machines that they are working. And so in 1912, it becomes a big election, and it's an election you do need to know about. The Republican Party is going to re-nominate Taft, keep a whistle blowing, but the Republicans are going to believe in a few things. They're going to believe in tariffs. High tariffs keep businesses here in America. They believed in workers' compensation laws. If you get hurt on the job, you get paid for it. They were against the initiative, referendum, and recall, which means a referendum is where people can get a question on the ballot. So a question might come about and say, should marijuana be legalized? And if the people vote yes in a referendum, then the politicians can make that a law. A recall is going to be where somebody's elected in to serve office, and the people say, you know what, I don't want this person to be in office anymore. They're not impeachable. They're just doing such a bad job. Let's vote to pull them back out, even before their term is over. So it could be like if they disagree with President Trump, you have a recall, and the president leaves office at that point. Or it's usually on the local level, governors, mayors, court justices, stuff like that. They were against bad trust, just like Teddy Roosevelt was. And they believed in a Federal Trade Commission and staying on the gold standard. But Teddy Roosevelt was unhappy with Taft, and so he decides to enter the race as well too. But the Republicans decided to stay with Taft, so he formed his own progressive, or better known as the Bull Moose Party. And when he does, he's going to believe in what's called new nationalism. And if you think about the idea of nationalism, of creating a nationalistic country at this time, it's very similar to the post-War of 1812, very similar to the reform movements of the Second Great Awakening. So he does come to this area. And some of the things that he's going to believe in is women's suffrage. He's the only one that believes that women should have a right to vote. It doesn't matter because women didn't have a right to vote, so he's preaching to somebody that didn't have the right. He did believe in graduated income tax, which is going to later on become the 16th Amendment. He also believed in lower tariffs. He thought that tariffs were too high. Businesses would not be able to expand because then other countries aren't going to buy your products as well too. He also believed in minimum wage laws. It's not going to be him, but rather his distant cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in the New Deal that's going to pass minimum wage laws. And he's also going to believe in child labor, getting rid of child labor, and workers' compensation. So some ideas are exactly the same. And the third party is going to be the guy that's going to win, and this is going to be Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic Party has been losing dramatically for the last 3 times. William Jennings Bryan was the candidate. By this time, they're just telling him to stop running. And so he was the governor in New Jersey, and he believed in what was called New Freedoms. He believed in tariff reduction as well, too. He believed in a one-term president, even though he served 2 terms. He did believe in direct election of senators. That's going to be the 17th Amendment. That's an idea from the Populist Party. He is going to believe in strengthening the Antitrust Act, which is also part of the Populist Party's idea, but he did not support women's suffrage originally. There's also Eugene Debs, a socialist, but we're not going to get into that because socialism is a terrible thing in this country. We're also going to look at some ideas here. And so, ultimately, the question is going to come down to, should women have the right to vote? There was ideas of lynching at this time period and trying to catch the lynch. Yes, 1 second. So, ultimately, this is going to come out. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. But ultimately, there are going to be a few amendments that are going to be passed. The 16th and 17th Amendments, the 18th Amendments for Prohibition, and the 19th Amendment allowing women to have the right to vote. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, but please upload your ideas. And your ideas should be evaluate the effectiveness of the progressive movement in bringing change. So did the progressive movement bring change to the country? And that's ultimately what you are asking and answering. And if you have any questions, I'll talk to you later. Please make sure you're at the meetings Tuesdays and Thursdays from 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock or 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock. I'll talk to you all later. Everybody, peace.